As we continue this series of video devotions in the book of Job, we're going to zero in now on Job's friends. And the dialogue that Job has with his friends make up the bulk of the chapters of the book of Job. From chapter 3 on through chapter 27, we get a cycle of three interactions between Job and his three friends that are listed in Job chapter 2, who are introduced into the narrative in Job chapter 2. And that makes up a great deal of the 42 chapters. They're introduced as Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. And it says when they had heard about Job's troubles, they came by agreement to go and sympathize with him and comfort him. When they saw him from a distance, though, they could hardly recognize him, and they began to weep aloud, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. Then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to him because they saw how great his suffering was. So this, I would say, is Job's friends at their best. Their willingness to move toward suffering, not away from it. The compassion they had to sit with him, to look at his suffering and share it with him as best they could. The Bible calls on us to show this kind of compassion, to rejoice with those who rejoice, but also to mourn with those who mourn, Romans 12:15. So that's Job's friends at their best. However, it mostly goes downhill from there. Job gave them this stark evaluation in Job 16:2. Miserable comforters are you all. I think anybody that knows anything about the book of Job and knows about the friends know that they do a bad job, that you don't want to be like Job's friends. And we know at the end in Job 42, God's evaluation is he's angry with the friends because they did not speak what was right about God as Job had done. All of them, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, have the same basic theology. It's what we call the law of retribution or the law of sowing and reaping. You reap what you sow. If you sow good, you'll reap good. If you sow evil, you reap evil. God is just and sovereign, and sinners are recompensed according to their works. If someone is suffering, it's because they have sinned. That's their basic theology. And they're so committed to this theology, and they actually make it proportional. If you're suffering greatly, it must mean you sinned greatly. And since they hadn't seen Job sin at all, because we know he hadn't, not in that pattern, they assumed he must have done great patterns of secret sin. He's like the ultimate hypocrite ever. At one point, Eliphaz says this is him at his absolute worst. He says in Job 22, "Is not your wickedness great? Are not your sins endless?" I mean, think about that statement, given what we know that God said about Job. And Satan didn't accuse him of anything. So Eliphaz is absolutely wrong about this. Job's wickedness was not great. His sins were not endless. But then he goes on to get detailed. You demanded security from your brothers for no reason. No proof of that. He never did it. You stripped men of their clothing, leaving them naked. No proof of that. Quite the contrary. He clothed the naked. You gave no water to the weary, and you withheld food from the hungry. No proof of that. Actually, quite the opposite. Job 31, he says he fed the hungry and the thirsty. Though you were a powerful man owning land, an honored man living on it, you sent widows away empty-handed and broke the strength of the fatherless. Quite the opposite. He cared for the widow and the orphan, and spoke up for them in court. And so Eliphaz says, that is why snares are all around you and why sudden peril terrifies you. So fundamentally, that was their theology. Job must have been a great sinner because he was suffering greatly. So what did Job's friends get right? Well, other than the fact that they came to Job and sympathized with him and wept over him and cared for him, even in their theology, they got some things right. God is, in fact, a moral king, and he does reign actively on earth. He's not the God of the deists who made the earth like a big clock and winds it up and then lets it run however it will. He actually does intervene. He does bring judgments on the earth. Also, the law of sowing and reaping is generally true. The Bible teaches it. You reap what you sow. That is generally true. We also know, as Job's friends have said, that man has a basic misery. Man is born to trouble as surely as sparks fly upward. We are going to have suffering and trouble in this world. In this world you will have trouble, Jesus said in John 16:33. We know also that God does in fact catch the wise catch the wise in their craftiness. So if you're crafty and clever as a wicked man and you dig a clever pit or lay down a clever snare, you may end up falling in your own pit. You may end up trapped in your own snare. God actually does this. And the Apostle Paul actually quotes one of Job's friends in 1 Corinthians. God catches the wise in their craftiness. So they do speak right theology to some degree. We know also it's true that only God can rescue us from God. God alone is powerful enough to deliver from his own hand. They make that statement. We know that God's natural wonders are amazing. They say that, and it is true. We know that it is true. Blessed is the one whom God disciplines. That is true. Some of our suffering is through discipline. And we know that it is God who wounds and also God who heals. All right, that's what they got right. What did they get wrong? Well, the law of sowing and reaping clearly doesn't work in reverse. You can't go from the harvest back to the seed every time. If someone is in immense sorrow and suffering, it doesn't mean that they have personally sinned. Clearly, the greatest example of this is Jesus. Jesus suffered more than anyone ever on the cross, but he hadn't personally sinned at all. But then we've got Job. Job's the quintessential example of a man who is blameless and upright and yet suffered great sorrows. So you can't reverse it. That reverse theology doesn't work. Also, they failed to listen sympathetically and believe their friend in his testimony. He asserted his innocence. He asserted that he hadn't done any great sins. They didn't believe it. They didn't believe the best about Job. They were themselves not humble. They assumed that they were more righteous than Job. Ironically, Job was more righteous than them. That's why he was singled out for this assault by Satan. So they were prideful, they were arrogant, and they failed to recognize that evil people frequently get away scot-free and go to their death in peace with loved ones around them in their deathbeds. That retribution doesn't frequently happen for the evil in this world. So the law of sowing and reaping frequently doesn't work when it comes to wicked people. Job pointed that out. And ultimately, they underestimated God's complex problem of evil and suffering in this world. The answers are not simplistic. They are complex. So, for us as Christians, we want to be friends to the suffering. We want to not just suffer well ourselves, but help others to suffer well. If so, do what Job's friends did well, but don't do what they did so very poorly.